Welcome, everyone. We'll give just a few minutes for everybody to join us. We're expecting well over 100 participants today, so we'll give everybody the opportunity to enter the space. If you're just joining us, we'll get started at about 1:02 today as we give everybody the opportunity to welcome themselves into the space and get ready for a wonderful conversation today. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I really am excited to welcome you all to this fantastic opportunity to have a conversation about how we turn privilege into progress. My name is Sasha Sensor, and I'm Anchor's Director of Education and Intersectional Collaboration. And it's super important that we come together today because we know that the world is changing. We know that these topics about inclusion, diversity, and equity and accessibility are always on the forefront of should we keep talking about them or not. But I think today's conversation is so important because, in some way, shape, or form, all of us have a privilege that we can use because privilege is power. And power, when used properly, can be a tool to leverage positive change in your community, in your organization, or even in the larger world at wide. So today's conversation continues to explore the themes that our friends and colleagues Matthew Knutson, Olivia Fadul, Arnetta Green, and Janelle Johnson shared with us when we last met and talked about how mental health of our colleagues is huge, especially for those who have been pushed to the margins of society. So today, we're excited to introduce you to four new voices who will share how when we name what privilege is and we actively work to recognize how it shows up in the workplace, it becomes a highly effective tool in dismantling the systems that have historically been added to the harms of marginalized humans when they come into the workplace. So speaking of our good friend Janelle Johnson, and in this work, the word human today is being used deliberately. Janelle introduced many of us to the beautiful work of Dr. Maya Angelou's poem, Human Family. And in Human Family, Dr. Angelou reminds us that despite our apparent differences that we share, whether it is our skin color, languages, traditions, and experiences, that we all fundamentally share a universal humanity. So we are more alike, my friend, than we are unlike. Today's conversation will help you identify those privileges that you have as a unique human being and provide honest insights into how you can be a powerful tool for progress by harnessing your power, whether it be rooted in your role, your lived experiences, or access to certain places that maybe your colleagues don't currently have access to. We'll explore practical ways to advocate for others, share knowledge, and dismantle barriers through intentional action. By the end of this session, we hope that you will feel empowered to use your personal and organizational capital to create lasting and positive change. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items. So, number one, please note that this presentation will be recorded and that the recording, along with any additional materials from our speakers, will be available to you all via our Anchor Connected community by next Wednesday. Secondly, I want to highlight that the captioning feature in Zoom is available for your use. To access it, you can locate the More option with three dots in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and click on this until you find the option that allows you to enable captioning. However, some of you might have a different version, and you can look down and see the traditional box with two C's in it, and that can also start the closed captioning feature. Please be aware that this feature utilizes artificial intelligence, which means that sometimes it may produce some occasional errors that are a little nonsensical, but it does its best. Thirdly, we kindly request that you put all of your questions for our presenters in the Q&A section located at the bottom of the screen. Time will be allocated at the end of the conversation for them to address all of your inquiries. However, please keep in mind the key rule of all of our community conversations. If you can Google it, don't ask it. It's essential for all of us to do some of the work of the research ourselves in order to learn and grow. So, with all of that in mind, I'm now going to introduce you to the panelists, and we'll start today by introducing Kristen. Kristen, if you could share with us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to join today's conversation.
Sure. Thanks for having me today. My name is Kristen Kemp. I am an elder millennial, white female, about shoulder length brown hair, wearing a pink shirt today. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as a person with an invisible disability. Right now, I work at CareSource, which is a managed care organization in the disability strategy research development space. Title is always wiggling a little. At CareSource, I'm also the founding chair of our employee resource group called the Alliance for Disability Empowerment. And prior to that, I was a public educator for just about 20 years, specializing in students and families with disabilities. So disability space is near and dear to my heart. And because of my position in public education, in society, and at my role at CareSource, I realize I have a lot of power to uplift more people. So that's why I'm here today.
Thank you, Kristen. We're so honored to have you in our space. Jonathan?
Greetings, everyone. My name is Jonathan Mahar Saez. I am a queer Latinx millennial nonprofit leadership strategist dedicated to addressing equity issues, building capacity, engaging community, and getting stuff done. I'm here today wearing a bright blue polo. I have olive fair skin and wearing glasses. And joining you today because I wear many professional hats that support organizations all over the continent, including capacity building and communications strategist. I'm an adjunct social work professor. I'm a DEI consultant, leadership development trainer, and I do a lot of work with fundraising and resource mobilization as well. So excited to share just the experiences that I've had, both personally as a professional, wearing many of those hats too, but as my work as a consultant, a coach, and a trainer, helping educate many nonprofit leaders in motivational and transformational ways on how they could advance equity in their personal and professional lives. Also helping with inclusive relationship building too, so we can create more spaces that have a sense of belonging, meeting human needs. And ultimately with strategic action planning to actually create organizations in capacity building and social justice ways that acknowledge the oppression that exists in our organizations and our community, but in moves to minimize them and remove barriers as well. So excited to be with the panelists and share some insights for as well. So thanks, Shasta.
We are excited to have you as well, Jonathan. Ashley?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ashley Ullman, she, her. I am joining you in a leopard, shirt, because that is one of the most neutral colors you can ever have. I'm rocking curly bangs, shoulder length hair, and I'm sitting in front of my gigantic bookshelf of books that I have been meaning to read forever. Why did I join the conversation about privilege and progress? First up, y'all, I identify as a mixed race, Black, neurodivergent human being. So the who I am and who I've always been, and being kind of right on that line of privilege and marginalization at the same time, or just being disabled enough or not quite Black enough has been my experience for always. And so being in that interesting space of nuance, I think also gives you almost like it's given me a front row seat to a lot of the ways that folks may not recognize when they can stand on business in different ways. Also, a lot of missed opportunities for organizations. As far as what do I do with myself during daytime and how do I get myself paid? I am an equity strategist of the organization called Allied Folk. We design tools and products to essentially help organizations do exactly what we're talking about today, which is use everything we have to reach our best work yet and to ultimately find every opportunity possible to do different and do better. Last but not least, because I'm dangerous on a mic, I'm here because I believe that doing better we shouldn't have to overwork. We shouldn't have to overthink, and we definitely shouldn't have to like overpay and have a billion gazillion dollars to do different. So those are some of the reasons why I'm here. Huge fan of Anchor and just absolutely excited to be here with my co-panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And last but certainly not least is Monica. But to those who do work with her very closely, she's often called Miss Mo. So, Monica, turning it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha, for that great introduction. And thank you to everyone that is attending this webinar today. I am Monica Wiley, often known as Miss Mo. And so let me go ahead and describe myself. So I am a Black woman, brown skin, with lovely gray glasses to match my lovely Black shirt. It does have leopard in there as well. So it does complement Ashley. Ashley, I think we, for some reason, was on the same page today in terms of the look. So I have on glasses, lovely Black with leopards in my glasses. I have lovely long flowing brown and blonde locks that just complement my glasses and flowing to the side of my face with some lovely, beautiful nails. If you can see them just a little bit, have some bedazzle on them to, again, match the outfit, the style, and who I am. Let me share a little bit about myself and why I am in this webinar and why this webinar is very important to me. This conversation is very important to me. As a person, a Black woman with a disability, it was caused by a drunk driver tractor trailer accident that killed my entire family at the age of 9. While my family and we recognized my disability, my physical disability, I did not realize just how discriminatory people with disabilities face until I graduated from college. I had friends that were not disabled. I was the only person that was a disability. So shout out to my friends from college who we definitely reflected DEIA because I was the only person with a disability, and they looked beyond that disability and still embraced me as a friend. This is the point that I am making. And in the disability world, when people thought about disability rights, it was often looked at in one color and in one way. It often showed up more as, in the more of the white space, white people, and not others that are impacted or others that are part of the disability community. And while I wasn't born with a disability, I became a part of the disability community because of that tragedy. And while in this space, I also recognized that there was power in the disability community, but the power wasn't spread out to everyone to be able to make meaningful impact. So the voices of people with disabilities that was part of the BIPOC community within the disability community was often left out. It was left behind. And that was something that needed to change because it also impacted employment opportunities for BIPOC women, for Black women with disabilities in this space. And so I come in this space because I have a background in DEIA, and I talk about how you can't talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access and belonging if you're not creating that pipeline of talking about the disability rights and some of the civil rights that were the foundational pieces of what DEI and DEIA is about. And so I come to that space as a consultant who I've consulted for a couple of organizations, but also I also bring that knowledge to the work that I do at the National Disability Rights Network as the voter engagement specialist and DIA practitioner. And what we've done so far with the work that we're doing in voting is that if you're talking about voting and you have your voting initiatives, If you don't have a component of DEIA associated with your voting outreach, then I'm not sure what your voting initiatives are doing, because that is what's on the ballot, that is what's being challenged, and those are the barriers that are impacting people with disabilities. So that's pretty much my reason for being here. And I'm also dangerous on the mic. So on that note, I'm going to be quiet and yield back to the panelists. And I'm honored to be with each of you today. Thank you.
I love people who are dangerous on microphones. Sometimes I feel like I might be one of them. So we welcome all of you into this space. Thank you for joining us today. And now that we've introduced the theme of our conversation about how privilege can be a tool for progress, y'all touched upon that just a little bit. I think we need to sort of begin to level set, because I have to tell you, privilege is like a scary word for people. It comes out and it's this thing of like, I automatically want to feel defensive when somebody says, well, you are privileged in such a way. And that's really not the goal of today. The goal of today is to talk about privilege as power and how you can capitalize your power to create the changes you want to see in the world. And so we're going to start off by having Jonathan kick us off in exploring how privilege manifests, how it intersects with power, and how we can begin to leverage those. So Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you to kind of level set this conversation for us.
Thank you so much. And I'm always energized hearing my fellow panelists. So thank you for all your great comments kicking off this conversation already as well. When I kind of joined this kind of webinar, I kind of would be like, we have to make sure we're being clear about what we're meaning by privilege, because as someone who is an educator and a trainer for many organizations in different spaces, especially in our field, people often, as Sasha just mentioned, are scared or confused and not sure what we mean when we say privilege. So we're just kind of sharing some definitions and level setting what we intend to, so that you can be empowered with the information and language and definitions to have better conversations in your teams and organizations. So, when we say privilege, privilege really means a special advantage or benefits that you necessarily didn't earn. You just got them because you are aware. They're kind of, again, an unearned advantage that society has given to you based on a specific aspect of your identity. And these could be things because of your race, gender, money, ability, or who you love too, and kind of recognizing that aspects of our identity usually hold more privilege than others in certain spaces. And since privilege is so ingrained in our society, sometimes it's really hard to notice it too. It's kind of the default mode to give certain people more access to privilege than others. So when we have to step back and reflect and understand it, it could be really hard to notice what that means too. And sometimes when people acknowledge and challenge it, they get a little nervous and scary because they're, feeling like something's being taken away from them, but realizing that we're just enlightening the opportunities and privilege that come with certain identities over others, and creating the space to kind of have a conversation, say this may be normal for you, but it's not normal for everyone, and recognizing that too as well, and what that's like and how people might react in that way, and use terms like reverse racism, which is not real, and kind of just recognizing that, this is challenging privilege and systems might be hard, and people have to kind of process and realize their discomfort related to as well. So and kind of building in that way too. So understanding privilege helps us work towards more fair and inclusive spaces for everyone specifically. So we can go next to talk about specific characteristics of privilege. And as I mentioned too, it's an unearned advantage. So privilege gives special benefits or advantages because they didn't earn too as well, and kind of recognizing that. It makes life easier. Privilege doesn't mean your life wasn't hard, but your life becomes easier because of certain identities of what that looks like too, as well, specifically. A quick example, my husband and I got married a few years ago, recognizing that we had to vet and do more work to vet vendors and guests and expectations for our wedding more than a heterosexual couple would, because recognizing that some vendors just didn't want to work with us too as well, or would be confused about things too, and recognizing that was more work on top of us than we had to do, given, you know, that a straight couple would have to navigate. So again, it's just an unearned advantage in that way. Privilege is invisible too, so it doesn't mean again, it sometimes feels normal for people. So when others people's challenge it, they're like, well, you can't define it, or I'm unsure what you're meaning by. So this invisibility of privilege makes it harder sometimes to identify and notice, but it's still important to acknowledge and build on that. Privilege also has an impact on fairness too. And really that's why many of us in the DIA space really are shifting again from equality to equity, because equity is about fairness and opportunity as well. We know, especially in the disability space too, in order to have equitable access to opportunities, sometimes some people need different types of support than others too as well. And privilege gives that extra support without just given in that way too as well, and recognizing that. So again, this is about fairness too. Privilege gives more people some fairness over others. It's system-based, so it's not necessarily, again, that one person in this you know, our community created this privilege in that sense too. It is based on societal factors, on how our world is really formed too as well, because it's not just based in privilege. While there's certain privilege and context in our country, we recognize that some of this exists, you know, outside in other spaces too, depending on what that looks like too. And it's really about who has given, you know, access to, who should have more access to resources has decided, and we've just built in that too as well. And privilege can have overlapping identities too. It can depend on a person's identities specific in that area as well. So you can have more privilege in one area versus another, but chase challenges in another specific identity too as well. You know, I just mentioned challenges that I face as a queer person too, but recognizing that, you know, I'm light-skinned and I'm a cisgender man too. I come with lots of other privileges that other folks might not be able to navigate too. So showing up in certain spaces too, while I face, you know, some challenges and some identities too, I can navigate the world differently in others as well. So recognizing that it usually is rooted in specific identities too, but some identities have more access to what we say power, that gives you more privileges in that way too. So just helping define some characteristics of privilege and what that looks like. And we'll go next to kind of help, you know, define how you might show up given your privilege in that way too. So our group defined about 4 different roles that individuals might have depending on privilege and where their situation too. So the first one on the left too is a perpetrator. And we don't want to be perpetrators, because these are people who are intentionally harming and treating people unfairly based on their differences too as well. These are people we think of who are discriminating, they're intentionally excluding too, they're making things worse, and there's no commitment of growth too as well. We don't want to be perpetrators, and we want to know how to navigate perpetrators and hold them accountable. Then we also have bystanders who might see all things going on, but do nothing. And, you know, they might stay silent, they don't act, they might allow harm to continue, and no commitment to work. And while we see this description, we don't want to be bystanders. We want to be, you know, working towards roles that take more action too. But we recognize that some people are bystanders for fear or lack of knowledge or discomfort or feeling defeated in their own way. So sometimes someone's a bystander not necessarily because they want to be a bystander. They might need some support to move up into more access to roles as well. In the third role, we have ally. So these are people who support others and speak up. They're educating themselves, they're standing up for others, they're speaking up. They create small changes in their community too. However, they recognize there's a low commitment to as well. And crucial for us to kind of acknowledge this space too, because many folks will kind of default when you bring up DIA and say, well, I'm an ally. Well, that's great too. It's easy to say you're an ally, but where is the demonstrated commitment to acknowledging and using your privilege to advocate for others too as well? And that leads us to our final role, which is accomplish or waymaker. And these are folks who are taking big, bold steps to remove barriers and also acknowledging the risks that come with it too as well. They are standing in solidarity with people who have less access to power and privilege and actively working to changing unfair systems. They're using their power to help others. They're creating lasting change and they have a moderate to higher commitment too. So we're helping, hopefully today, all of you are walking away and kind of figuring out how you can be, an accomplice and waymaker and kind of building on that. And the last kind of slide I just wanted to share was talking about different types of power, because we mentioned power in terms of this situation too. And again, important for us to name power so we understand how different ways it might show up too, and how we can use it to advocate for others, but also distribute power so that there's more equitable distribution of power in our spaces. So first, we have formal power. So that's the power to ask others in a certain way. That sometimes might be the default power we think of our organizations. Like we think of our bosses or the CEOs who can tell us what to do. So that's the only type of power in our organization too as well. But you see here, there's many different types of power too that might show up. But these people, they can bring people together to make it happen too as well. I often work with organizations where I'm saying, I won't work with you unless the CEO's on board, because I don't want their power to come in and influence that too as well. So I use and work with folks and kind of use the formal power to bring people together to address issues. Our second power is reward power too as well. And that's the power to reward benefits or encourage someone to do something. So think of the people who have access to resources in your organization or can influence pay or time off or benefits. Those are often folks with reward power too as well. And those people can encourage and motivate change too. So they can say, hey, if people are making change and doing this too, they can offer those rewards and share those resources to support the change initiative if that's there. Then we have coercive power too. And coercive power is that type of power that we want to acknowledge that we might not want to kind of utilize, but acknowledge that it exists too. That this might be the power to scare or hurt someone into making them do something as well. So while, again, we recognize that that might show up too, it's not necessarily something we want to distribute and build on because it can be, again, harmful or scary or hurtful. But it is an opportunity to speak up against harm too as well and kind of acknowledge to say, hey, I have this power to call someone out too. Maybe I'm going to use that in this space too, that another colleague might not be able to have too as well, and think about in that space. So our fourth type of power is expert power. And this is the power to guide or affect others because of your knowledge and skills. So think of the colleague that knows everything about this specific issue and nothing gets done unless you ask this colleague what's going on, and recognizing that that might happen in some spaces too, in building on that. I know as a consultant, I show up in many spaces sometimes and I'm given expert power because of my role sometimes too, and recognizing that that comes in and people are more likely to listen to me than they might for their own colleague, even though we might be saying the same thing. So recognizing that expert power might show up, but you can use this to teach others, take on roles where you're helping others learn. Not everyone learns in the same way. So kind of using your kind of opportunity to help people learn in a way that works best for them. We have two more types of power. I know I'm sharing a lot of information, but we have our informational power, which is the power to guide others from important information. So these are the people who are always in those meetings and they know everything about everything in the organization too as well. So they might just have information that kind of allows them to guide that as well. We saw this as an important power to have during the early stages of the pandemic too. If many of you thought about any of your organizations when people were like, we don't know what's going on, but only some people in the organization knew what was happening, what was the next step, building on that too. And many times when we don't have access to information, we have deficit thinking. And we unfortunately kind of resort to bad things because we don't have access to information without actually thinking through as well. So when you have access to information, you can be a liaison and share more information. You act as a bridge and give the opportunity to information share across this system. And the last type of power, I pronounce it referent power. Some other people might call it something else too, but it's the power to connect with people because they like you. So we have to kind of think about those people who are just charismatic and they're really nice. And we just like to hang out with them too as well. And we recognize that that comes with power too, because when we have to challenge someone or give feedback that's negative to someone we really like, we might not do it as an impactful way or as constructive way as someone we didn't like to as well. So, think about, if you've ever had a colleague that did something wrong and someone's like, they couldn't do anything wrong. They're so nice. Like, we love them. Recognizing that comes with power too, for the ability to build on that as well. However, these type of people are all about getting the buy-in. They're convincing the people, and they get people on board and support, and recognizing that buy-in, inclusive engagement, and accessible opportunities to be involved is key to DEI success. And these type of people can help build on that too as well. So thank you all for kind of listening to our level setting. I know I shared a lot of information too, and I'm just excited to get back to our panelists and hear more from them. So I'll turn it back to Sasha to kick us off, moving forward.
No, I so appreciate it. There was actually text messages going off about how excited people are already about this conversation. So if I looked down, it was like my phone was blowing up in an absolutely positive way. Jonathan and Ashley, you know, one of the things that you talked about is this ability of how you show up in spaces presents a variety of different privileges. And that's something that I certainly feel in my particular role. So you know, we've all been shaped by these different experiences and identities, and we know that privileges can manifest themselves in ways we've just talked about that are obvious and sometimes very hidden. So I'd like to ask some of you to get started with to share both the privileges that you sort of hold that are easily identifiable and maybe those that are less apparent. And I know, Ashley, you've already kind of shared this in your overall introduction. So maybe build upon that a little bit and talk about some of the topics you love, like positional authority and institutional power. So what are the obvious privileges you hold, and what are some of the ones that are less obvious that you've been grappling with recently?
Hey everybody, this is Ashley. So yeah, to run it back, how I move through the world, I identify as being a mixed race, Black, neurodivergent woman. And I kind of talked a little bit about being at that little crossroads of privilege and marginalization. Something I would add to this topic, especially with regard to like institutional power or positional authority, is the where you are makes a difference. I think that's my location has been one of the more pungent ways, and I've been able to tell whether I'm in or whether I'm out. I'm joining you here. I don't know if y'all have noticed I've got a sign behind me. It's a little Minnesota sign. That's where I'm at. You also might hear it in my O's. Y'all, the North, the Midwest, there's a lot of thoughts and feelings and assumptions about the spaces that we've created. And those of us that are here in the Midwest or raised in the Midwest, you know that like some of the antidotes, if you're anecdotes of who we are and our niceness, for example, are all relative as well to the experiences that you're having. So with regard to like beyond me as an individual, I think those experiences, you know, again, growing up in the school system, on one hand, as a student, knowing I was not being taken seriously, but when my white mom came, that I would be. That was me starting to grow eyes for, you know, institutional responses to my identities. I also somehow knew as a child that if I was darker skinned or if I was a young boy doing the things that I was doing in class, because I'll be honest, I was cutting up. You know, I somehow knew that you know, it could be worse, but it could also be better. I knew that. I could feel that and I could sense that. And so I think when it comes to this topic of like privilege and leveraging power, and especially when we go beyond our individual experiences and we start to manifest that into action, one thing that I've been learning about since I was young and I'm trying to put into work now is how do we recognize those longer standing patterns within the spaces where we are. So we're, you know, many of us are probably here joining work. But what about if you are in a faith community? What about if you are, I don't know, you play intramural basketball, so that means you're at the community gym. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you know, and places that we go where we recognize who's in and who's out. One other thing I would share with regard to like those patterns and our ability, excuse me if y'all can hear the dog barking, our ability to show up and do things differently and to really step into our power is, you know, really being intentional about listening to our bodies. Like we don't need to over intellectualize the feelings that we have in our bodies about who's in and who's out, what's going right, what's not, what are we missing, and so on. And so, the last thing I'll say, because I think my doggo Brisket is about to really take the mic and go with it, is as we continue to unpack this topic and the ways that who we are, the differences that make a difference show up. The thing that I've been most excited about is working with organizations on practical ways that they can start to disrupt the decisions that we're making, those patterns that we're making, to start to change up the outcome of who is in and who is out.
Ashley, I really appreciate that. So since moving into the IDD space, we are a conference like driven community. Like it's exciting. We get together, we convene, we share ideas. If you all know, I help run Anchor Connect, so I'm going to be a little biased. But when I am not running an event and I'm showing up as an attendee, oh, am I awkward? Like it is uncomfortable for me because I don't always feel like I have like yet become part of the space. But I do have privilege and then I have relationships with people in a smaller scale that I've developed over time. And I try to find the person who feels like as awkward as I do, like, and make a friend and then introduce them to somebody else that I know, right? So that I'm building community and at the same time sharing that privilege I have of like, this is one of our really great partners. Have you had a chance to meet them yet? It could just be culturally, I come from a very high matchmaking community. So I view it as people matchmaking, but I get that sense of like, you don't have to be out. You can use your privilege to start building community in different ways with different people. And that's something to think about. Simply, who do you know and how can you expand those connections? That is a form of power, right? It's that informational sharing. So think about that the next time you're at a networking event. How do you leverage that in a space? Monica, it's a hard transition to you specifically because, your story is so poignant and vulnerable. And you lay it out there as this is my life. And it takes people a moment or two, I think, if not longer, to really grapple with what you have shared, which is why I want to kind of bring us back there. Because I think one of the amazing privileges that you have brought up is that your friends were anti-ableist. They did not view you in a different way, and that allowed you access to their world because they weren't ever going to keep you out based on presumptions. So I know that you are very much looking forward to talking a little bit more about those relationships and also building upon some of what Jonathan had shared about power and power dynamics. So Ms. Moal, we'll turn it over to you about what are some of the most transparent things that you think people really get out of your identity that you bring into the space and privilege, and then what are things that you hold as privilege that you think other people don't realize and is maybe something they could think about?
Sasha, thank you so much for the question. And again, delighted to be on the webinar with this great group of individuals that serve on the panel with me, and to all the attendees here. One thing that you said is definitely something that I want to zone in on or hone in on, and then it will go in the direction of answering the other parts of the question that you brought up. When you said that my friends bought me, or pretty much in essence made sure that I was a part of their world. And I think the reason why they were able to do that was because that they recognized that I was once a part of that world, and that me being once a part of that world changed by tragedy. Yes, it was tragic, but also she still can be a part of that because she is who she is, right? She still has her identity, who she is, which leads to something that I'm going to share that's a little bit more intimate pertaining to my story. When the doctors, and I remember there was a police officer in the room, and they said that my parents didn't, my mom and my 3-month-old sister and stepfather didn't make it, and I was the only survivor of that accident. I remember I turned my head to the right, and I was just in a daze because that was a lot to take in at the age of 9, right? That's a lot to absorb. And I don't know if that was my mom's spirit or if that was God. I grew up as a Christian in a Baptist church, And those principles have guided me in the work that I do, and also in the person that I am. But I'm bringing this up because the thought came to me was, Monica, you have two options. You either can wallow in self-pity and say, woe is me, and why is this happening to me? And it's not fear, which it wasn't fear. Or you can embrace what's here. You're a child, and you still have a lot of life to live. And whatever comes from this in terms of embracing this new life, you would just deal with it face on and continue to be Monica. And because I've always been a futuristic thinker, so I always was looking at me being a young adult and a teenager and being a little bit of a heathen, which I was in college. The point that I am making is that my friends were, and people in general, when I'm sharing my story, and I'm also told my DIA, they're able to see that too could be them, that they too at an instance could happen to them something tragic. You could fall and become disabled, again, by a drunk driver if you're a sports player. So I think what makes my story so unique, and what also helps in terms of shifting a little bit of the way that the power is used in the disability community and bringing a more diverse voice, is I have a way of showing how, yes, I am a part of the disability community because I am disabled and I have this physical disability, but I am also an individual that was not disabled, and that because I come from both worlds, I have been able to leverage both of those to show that just because you are disabled now doesn't mean you still can't enjoy the other fruits of life, other aspects of life. It is about being self-assured in who you are, which also leads to about power and privilege in the workplace. When you know that you are who you are in spite of your disability, you are able to say and come to your boss or come to whomever that's in your committee or group or whoever or department that you work in and say, hey, I have this idea. And the idea may be crazy. The idea may be something that may not necessarily manifest at that particular time, but there may be a word, there may be a quote that you may use, or there may be a certain statement that you may say that will resonate with someone and say, aha, I can see this. This is something that I maybe can see in the future that can be a vision. And that's how we leverage our power and the privilege and the place that we're in within our power and privilege to make sure that we are supporting others and making sure that we are sharing that power and diversifying the voice within the workplace, and also diversifying the voice within the disability community. And so that is how I've been able to use my story. That's how I've been able to talk about the importance of DEIA and making sure that you recognize that, yes, disability exists, but look beyond the disability. Because at the end of the day, we still have other aspects of us that can be very valuable, that's very contributing and very resourceful in a way that makes sure that the workplace is more engaging, it's more inclusive, and it provides a pipeline for others as well. And so that's what I wanted to share. And I hope that answers your question, Sasha. And I hope that was something that people can that will resonate with others when they leave the webinar.
You know, Monica, I think that it will resonate. I mean, certainly for me, it does, in the sense that we've been talking about that all of the different identities that we contain give us different spaces in the world, right? And, you know, there are lots of times where people are like, what is this pasty white girl doing as a DEIA practitioner? And I'm like, well, you know, I fall into the model minority trap. And like, there's, you know, differences that lie. And it's nice because the privilege is I have an opportunity to walk amongst different worlds, learn and help build bridges, right? And that's how I choose to leverage what the color of my skin gives me as a personal privilege. But like Kristen, you know, some of us have visible disabilities and some of us don't have visible disabilities. And there are things that both bring privilege and non-privileges into that space, like Jonathan was talking about, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on where you are and you occupy. So Kristen, you've done so much work at CareSource, focusing on making sure that individuals who have disabilities have a space to kind of get together and commune, and not kind of do get together, commune, share, lift each other up. Could you talk about the same question, how those privileges can be very transparent and show up for you, how sometimes those that are not as transparent are ones that you leverage, and specifically talking about addressing the privilege of choosing whether you have a choice to disclose, which is certainly something that I can resonate with.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, I'm super excited to talk about this. Actually, as a child who grew up definitely having ADHD, and it was never acknowledged, diagnosed, certainly wasn't treated. I kind of grew up in this space of constantly feeling left out, constantly feeling kind of humiliated, and becoming a fantastic masker where I could pretend to listen, I could pretend to do this, did great on tests, but my homework grades were garbage because I just couldn't keep up, and I kept hearing, words around me like lazy, disengaged, things like that, that were pretty disheartening. And I got my diagnosis as an adult when I was in college in the education program, and we were learning about things like ADHD. And I was like, oh my goodness, I think this is about me. And so at that point, I was able to get help for myself. But what I noticed as I grew into the education world is that that's super common that we are overlooking our students, especially girls, with neurodivergencies. And so I became a pretty noisy advocate in that space as an educator because it was very easy to identify hyperactive, loud kind of behaviors from our boys, and they were getting help right away in kindergarten and first grade. And then we have girls sitting in eighth and ninth grade who are on the struggle bus, and their power is being taken from them because they're seen as disorganized and lazy and like it's a choice. And so right now, I really try to use my position at CareSource and just in life to normalize disability, normalize the invisible disabilities that show up. And I know, I'm a pretty upfront about, my one of my disabilities shows up as I'm kind of a slow processor. So during a meeting, I probably won't speak up too much. I'm great at listening and taking notes. And I usually come back with ideas later. And I just put that out there, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from teammates and colleagues that are on those meetings, like, oh, I think I might think that same way too. And so just kind of opening the door because I'm in a place of trust and power now, between my day job and leading an ERG. And I'm able to do that. I also have noticed, just as a mom of kids with some disabilities, when I show up to school, a lot of times I've got the school leaders or teachers telling me, this is how the education system works. Maybe you don't understand. And then when I pull my educator card out, suddenly I'm being listened to, and my kids are getting the documentation and help that they need. And so it's been a lesson in experiences rather than just being told to me that these are some powers you have, and here's some ways you can advocate for yourself and your family and for others. But really, it all comes down to, normalizing disabilities, educating about disabilities, and lifting people up, through the connections and power that I have.
Education as a tool is so important in talking about how we access privilege. And education doesn't need to be formal education, right? Education can be conversations, it can be exposing people to different experiences that they may not have had before. And so I totally understand that. As we transition a little bit into this next session, Kristen, you mentioned an ERG, and this will talk about privilege, right? If you're in the DEIA space and somebody says to you, are you a part of an affinity group? Most people know that that means like you're in a group of people who share some sort of identity, right? I didn't have that knowledge when I first showed up. And the very first conference I went to, like, there was this affinity presentation being led by these two white men, and there was all white people in the room. And I was just really curious, like, how we were going to talk about affinity with, like, no people of color in the room. And I, being dangerous with a mic, raised my hand and asked. And they looked at me and they said, "This is about insurance." And I had no idea that affinity groups could be used different ways in different environments, right? So with that in mind, since an affinity group means something to me, and not everybody may be familiar with what an ERG is, could you share what an ERG is and how that works?
Yeah, so ERGs are new to me too. ERG stands for Employee Resource Group. And CareSource was my first exposure to that. So it's just been about 2.5 years where I had even learned they exist, and they do sit in our DE&I space. And at CareSource, we've got about 10 groups, and they represent different marginalized communities. What's cool about them is they are grassroots. And so all 10 of them were started by regular employees. So people who are below a director level, which is also really cool because it's very powerful to be in that space, and it's a little less risky, to be honest, that I'm not in a position of a ton of power at CareSource. And so I was able to gather support and get executive leadership and things like that on my side to sponsor my work and champion my work. But ultimately, it was creating a safe space for employees to show up authentically as they are. So when I first joined CareSource, I'm sure someone told me we had 5,000 employees. I was blissfully unaware of that. And so I started joining some ERGs, and there was one for women, one for the LGBTQ plus community. Those were two that spoke to me right away. So I joined those immediately, and then I, started digging around, like, where's the disability one? I want to be that. And there wasn't one. And so, I dug around, poked around our HR department. I was in that department, so I had a little more access to those people, and was able to get charter documents submitted. CareSource is mostly remote employees, so I was sitting in my basement doing this, kind of getting it going. And we've grown to over 100 members in just over a year, putting it out there. So it's very cool. It's in Deem, I'm sure everyone knows. So right now we're putting on a really cool learning sessions and panels talking about all of these things are really important for disability empowerment and disability employment. But yeah, they're really great groups that advocate for marginalized communities.
I appreciate you mentioning that you had more access, right? Because you were already in the human resources department. Again, that speaks to one of the positional power things that categories that Jonathan brought up early on, right? It was the privilege of having greater access to the decision makers, and that you utilize that to really make a huge difference in your organization. We're going to shift a little bit now to really, again, talking about how can we make sure that we're using these privileges to knock down some of these barriers that face us as individuals in the workplace. In particular, one of the things that is really interesting is understanding how to shift between becoming a bystander, right? And taking where you are in an organization and helping to manage up and creating higher positions of power. Because a lot of times people are always really nervous, right? About losing power if they have it. And if they don't have power, losing the nominal amount of power that maybe they feel like they have. So before I ask this next question, I have been reminded that in my enthusiasm to introduce you all, I forgot one key part of our housekeeping, which is having these conversations, folks, in a void can be a little awkward. So if you want to show love to our attendees and our speakers as they are going through and telling and sharing their stories, we encourage you heavily to use those hearts and hand claps and cheers or whatever. Thank you. We've got the first one showing up in the space. So love always makes us lean in even a little bit more. So Ashley, I'm going to turn this over to you a bit. Um, Yeah, what do we do about risk aversion? How do we like identify which privileges help us mitigate what we think are harms of doing this work?
Ooh, y'all. So risk aversion, and like it's ironic because the last time I talked, I said trust your gut, trust your body. Risk aversion is your body being like, whoa, something's up, right? Or whether it's an individual, you're an individual, thinking about you at Target and you notice a thing and you're like, ugh, do I do a thing? Or you're at let's say you're at work and you are in a either a planning group or a decision-making role, and you get that, like something should be done, but I just don't know. Um, the to overcome risk aversion, I think it's twofold. When it comes to us as individuals, we have to know ourselves, like period point. There's just no way around it. Ms. Mo was talking about it. Others have talked about it. Kristen was talking about like, yeah, getting a diagnose, like knowing more about myself then made me more aware. It's like until we get to a place where we have taken the time we deserve to better understand who we are, how we got to be who we are, where we are, what we're doing, all that good stuff. It's just like, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, y'all, but point blank, we're not going to be able to leverage our privilege or power. Just like end of story. So womp womp. Sorry, I should have started with that. Okay. My name's Ashley and I'm bringing the doom and gloom. That being said, we are in control of that. And that is power. Like we get to decide, we get to tap in, we get to push the envelope when we're ready to do that, and get to make that choice. And so, though, it's kind of like this cliffhanger moment of like, am I going to do the thing or not? Maybe sometimes I lean into that discomfort more than others, and that's okay too. But I think when it comes to like individual, interpersonal, that's something that we decide to commit to every day, in whatever way that manifests. Okay, but now when it comes to organizational, this is where my neurodivergence gets like very apparent and nerdy. So Sasha, like, let me know if I'm at 27 minutes.
Okay, just
And I
count
gotta cut
down as we
back.
go.
Yeah. But no, so when it comes to the organizational side, y'all, this is where I think it gets juicy and exciting quick. We are already paying for our risk aversion. People are leaving. People are burnt out. Sometimes, depending on the industry that we're in or the type of work that we're doing, not only do folks make their moves, they also use something called the internet to share about it. So, we can look at lawsuits and litigation. We can look at complaints, grievances. There's all sorts of data that in general organizations typically track about who comes in, who goes out, what's happening, et cetera. When it comes to risk aversion, I firmly believe that it's about us understanding again ourselves as organizations. Let us understand how our decisions are impacting the environment. Let us understand how our language that we've been using publicly, the watered down language or the punched up language that we're like, let us understand how we have been showing up, what has been happening in the environments that we curate, and then we can start to talk about, leveraging power and privilege, et cetera. So
Oh, Ashley, I
it's
can.
yeah, it's a both. It's a similar. Sorry, Sasha. One last thing.
No, you're
It's
good.
it's it's a matter of being able to recognize like our desire to want to do a thing cannot get in the way of our first step, which is first understanding like what is it that can or should be changed.
No,
I yield my time.
it's okay. It is fabulous to hear that because one of the things that I've been most proud of at Anchor is we knew we wanted to take this journey, but we also knew we had to clean up our own internal practices before we got out there. Like before we built coalitions, before we went and joined other people in doing work, we had to take a hard internal look at what we could be doing better. And it's not the sexy front of the page newspaper grabbing headlines work. It's the hard get into the weeds, look at your policies and practices kind of work. And I think everybody within their own department, right, can look at what they do on a daily basis. Those are the tasks you own and figure out, how could I be doing this a bit better? And every time a bit better adds up into a whole lot more better, right? Jonathan, you are often in the same alignment with the trainings that Ashley is talking about, especially about how naming privileges and the responsibility that comes with what are those next steps, and how, when individuals are ready to take those next steps, they can leverage their privilege for positive change. Could you talk a little bit more about that, especially in environments where people may think that they don't hold what is that formal traditional power, but they have other powers they can use?
Sure. And I appreciate all this too, because really it's kind of setting us up with like pulling themes from everyone and say, like, first one, defining and understanding all the important aspects too. Like we have to acknowledge what it looks like as well. And even like assessing where we're at too, like what our feelings are related, what issues are impacting to all the unintentional and intentional harm that was created in our organizations too. And then really focusing on processing that too, like not like like co-panelists mentioned, like you can't move too forward unless you know what's going on too. Like you have to process that too as well. Like oppression is trauma. Like it's not like this is like work that's like building into this and like all great to do that as well. And it impacts people of both privileged and unprivileged identities. So how are you taking care of yourself and healing through that process to make sure that you're centering your feelings too and kind of focusing on the how you're healing and growing in that way. And then when you kind of taking that process too, I think it's more of what I like to call activation, and kind of where we then name, our privileges, we name our access to power too, but also be strengths focused on like what are we best good at and what are you doing? Like, Kristen just mentioned too of like the note taker and then sharing their thoughts after as well. Like we need those people because like I'm not that person in those meetings sometimes too. Like I'm just rambling and then I say everything forward and then we have to go back and then listen to what it says too as well. So but complementing those strengths too, so make sure we don't forget anything and what it looks like too, but recognizing what that looks like. For example, I think of like, engagement and relationship building is key to this work. So who is the best credible messenger sometimes to give feedback, to persuade buy-in too sometimes, and recognizing that too. So, for example, I'm often in spaces too, and especially in spaces where, in human service field, where the majority of people that are workplace are white cisgender women too, as well. And sometimes I'm not the best person to say, something to as well, even though I want to, and I recognize that, where I might ask a colleague who listened to me under support to kind of advocate their message too as well. But then I also might, come in and say, when someone says something, a subtle acts of exclusion related to race too as well, even though I have a mixed identity, I might step up more so my colleagues of color don't have to bear the burden of educating and building on that too, because I recognize that I should be doing that more as well, and kind of taking on that too and helping call that out because I might come across differently than someone else in that way too. So kind of using these kind of activation skills, and then you can build like your teams around it. You can kind of understand action planning based on like privilege, access to power, and our strengths in a way to kind of do all this complex work too as well, and kind of go on this journey that you're kind of focusing on to kind of advance on that. So, really, kind of summarizing what I just said, like, assessing and understanding what privilege and power access you have, acknowledging and healing too, and then focusing on how you're activating those to then advance some change in your organization.
Thank you for that. It really rings a bell for me because my colleagues and I have a tap-in policy. And so they often recognize that maybe I'm not the best messenger for something. And so they have said to me often, let me know when you need me to tap in. And in the beginning, I wasn't quite sure how I felt about that, right? Like I should be able to do the work that I've been asked to do, but not every messenger is the right person to bring something into a current space. And when you allow people to tap in, right? Or you vocally say, I need help with X, you're giving them an opportunity they may not have considered before about how they take that next step from allyship to accomplice, right? Or to waymaker. Like a lot of times people aren't always sure what the right next step is. We talked about that earlier. So naming it, sharing with people how they can tap in is also a way that you can leverage those relationships and help people find their power that they may not know they ever even had. So I think that that feeling of openness and transparency are key. As we've been talking about this conversation, you all have brought a lot of different examples to the table, and I really want to dive in a little bit more into those practical, real world examples that we've been talking about. So, Kristen, we just kind of talking about the employee resource groups, right? The ERGs. So, I would love for us in a second to get to talking about that and ensuring like how can organizations give their people the tools to create that kind of programming? And I'm going to pause there and actually go to Miss Mo first, because I've changed up the order of the conversation. And so, Miss Mo, what I would love to talk about first is you've talked about all of the powerful platforms that you have built in the disability space to amplify the voices of others, right? Where you are essentially doing that tapping in and that support that Jonathan's talking about. Could you share how mentorship and visibility have played a really crucial role in your work to foster inclusion and create change in spaces?
Sure. And Sasha, I actually wanted to just kind of talk a little bit more about what Jonathan and Ashley had mentioned when
Absolutely.
talking about how to make some of these changes that you want to see happen in your organization and the respective position that you're in. But there's that whole, risk aversion and the way that it makes your body feel. And I think part of the issue with that, or part of the reason why that happens, is because we have to shift the narrative of how we see ourselves, but also shift the narrative of some of these unfortunately systems that have been in place for quite some time that have played a very unfortunate strategic role and not being able to move an organization forward in terms of diversity and in terms of making sure that we're being more equitable with the work that we're doing, with the advocacy that we're doing, with making sure that we are putting into practice true DEIA principles. And so when we look at some of the biases that we have, because we have to recognize too that there are some biases that we have within ourselves, they play a role in some of us not getting as far as we would like to. Some of the individual and institutional biases, and I won't go into that because that can go very deep into the weeds, and maybe that'll be a conversation webinar for another day. But I think ultimately, if we look at some of these systems that have been in place that have marginalized not just the BIPOC community, but just have marginalized the work overall in our organizations and shift the narrative, then I feel like we would get further ahead. So now let me go ahead and segue into your question. Because I was dying to get in on it. And I was like, oh, Sasha, please call on me next, please, for any additional thoughts. Thank you.
Of
Um,
course.
and speaking to that, one of the powers that Jonathan mentioned that I have been able to effectively use in making sure that we diversify the voice of the disability community is the reverent power. And that is the power that that you have the ability to influence others. And when others recognize your ability and your skill, and they're able to connect with what you're saying, because again, like I said before, when I share my story, I make sure that it's relatable all the way around, making sure that people see that before I became disabled, I was just this bad little child that just thought she knew it all and could run her mouth and was just being rambunctious and annoying, to now being a person with a disability and bring a little bit of that sass with her, but recognizing how to now navigate the disability world and move some of these barriers that are happening in the disability community to make sure that we are creating a more inclusive and a more equitable lane for myself in the BIPOC community, but then also others in the disability space within the BIPOC community. And so when you use your power, your reverent power, and having that privilege and recognizing that, and others see that, that's when the mentorship comes into place, because they admire who you are. They admire how you've been able to navigate these spaces, and all of the there have been some very uncomfortable times and very uncomfortable actions that have taken place for me to get to where I am. But that's also a part of the power and the privilege that you have to make sure that no one else has to go through that, or go through that as much as I have. And so that's where the mentorship comes in. That should be the center of your mentoring. It's the power that you have, and recognizing that power that you have that influences others, that others that are encouraged and inspired by your work, inspired by your story, inspired by you as a leader, to then make those types of changes, and then make sure that we are passing the mantle to the next set of generational leaders that will come behind us to continue to build on the great work that we're doing. And so this is something I'm very passionate about. This is something that should be at the core of everyone's DEIA strategic plan and their respective workplace. This is something that's not just in the workplace, but also in society and your respective groups and networks overall. So it's not a monolithic thing or theme. This is something that can be incremental and instrumental in every aspect of your life. And so I hope I answered your question, Sasha. And I know I can talk too. I have so much more to share, but I'm going to stop right there.
No, you need to do a podcast with everything, along those lines. And I think that 90 minutes is never enough, right? To talk about all of the wonderful complexities of what make us human. And I think what you were really saying is going back to that notion that every individual has a relationship with somebody, right? Every individual has some sort of influence because of that relationship in either a small space or a large space, right? And so how you enter into those moments, how you don't even realize sometimes that you are being looked at by other individuals who admire you, who you may not know admire you, right? And they're modeling your behavior of what they think is right. Just that notion that somebody is looking to you is a privilege you often don't even know that you carry. And it can be burdensome moving into spaces where you're like, I don't know who's watching, but you could also view it as the privilege of, I have no idea who I get to influence in this space right now. So I'm going to model the exact behavior that I would want other people to model as a way to be an active accomplice in this space. Kristen, that goes back to modeling best practices, not just as an individual, but as an organization, right? So CareSource has gone ahead and modeled this really great practice of employee resource groups. So could you share some strategies that organizations and individuals can use to build those types of spaces from the ground up? You mentioned it was a grassroots effort.
Yeah, thank you. So one thing that CareSource has in its back pocket is its size. With so many employees, it was less difficult for me to find people who wanted to join up. And when I think about my experience as an educator, I think if I had had the support of an ERG, maybe I would still be an educator. Maybe I wouldn't have left. Um, and so, when I am constantly thinking about that, because my work is with complex populations and ideating for that. Right now, I'm looking at workforce shortage. We look at the people who interact with our complex populations. There's a huge turnover. They're experiencing a lot of the things I experienced as an educator, where there's high burnout, high just exhaustion. And then on top of that, not feeling like they can show up authentically because they are just racing to try to keep up with everything. So I've had a lot of of those kinds of things, and I've thought about, what if a whole county worth of districts could join up, or a whole county worth of community-based um, centers or programs could join up and create that community, because it's both formal and informal. I think it starts off informal, where we're just kind of gathering, who do we know, who can help us influence. We talk about that referent power. I am so introverted, just a little bit backwards. And so I knew, when I wanted to create this group, it's the first ERG ever for people with disabilities at CareSource. And so I knew I needed to get some of those people on my side. I knew I needed to get influencers. And so I looked around in that space to kind of try and find that. And what's been really cool to see, we've just got started up in April of 23. I since then the ERG is now the authority on disability things. And so when before CareSource was putting out literature around language, policies, things like that, and they were just, maybe doing their best. Now we've got voices of employees with disabilities, with lived experience, influencing that space. There's not things getting put out that are not run by the ERG first. And so that's been a really cool change to see, that we're, now the authority on that. We're influencing mentoring programs. So it's been really cool. So the idea I have is, like going back to kind of my educator roots, there's a book called Rainbow Fish, and there's yeah, like they all, they all individually, they're a little less powerful, but when they all joined forces, they kind of became this big fish, and it was way more beautiful and super powerful and influential. And that's kind of how I view the ERGs. And so, just trying to find that power and network. I'm great at that because I know I know I am not the voice. And so networking to kind of find that influence and to kind of become that big, beautiful, influential, powerful rainbow fish, is sort of the outcome of the ERG.
Kristen, I appreciate that. I think it goes back to everybody can leverage their power in different ways. It doesn't have to be the same for all. So I'm going to give everybody a couple of minutes, if they have it, to put their questions in the chat for our panelists. But in the meanwhile, I'd like to go back to Jonathan and just start with that. What would you like the top takeaway to be for this group today, if they had to take one takeaway? And what would you encourage people to try as a first step to utilize their power?
Oh, good question. I'll kind of focus on an organizational, what you can do in work too as well, because I know many of us talked about personal aspects too as well. I think the first thing, after you've understood what your privilege and power is do as well, is to kind of assess, like, before you start anything new and stuff like that, to center the people most impacted by it and center the people who have less access to that power too as well. So like when you're kind of designing new policies, doing a new event, launching a new initiatives too, before you get too far, ask the people with less power and access to the conversation first, so you can learn from them how you might inadvertently cause harm or kind of build on that too as well. Like that, easy thing. Like we think about policies all the time. Someone with a leadership writes it too, and then then 2 months later, we realize, oh, it's harming our DSPs, or it's making it more harder for the administrative staff too as well. Well, if you could have asked them in the beginning of the process first, you could have avoided that too and built buy-in and focus on that too as well. Same with planning a new event, same with designing a new training or initiative too. Center the experiences of people first before you do anything new. So as you'll embark in these initiatives and kind of build on new change in your organization, say, who is this going to impact in this organization? And maybe we should ask them first in inclusive and accessible ways to make sure that they can share their voice in doing that too. So that's probably one thing I'd say as well. I know there was a question on classism too, thinking about policies. Like, ask the people who make the least money any aspect about health insurance or benefits and stuff like that too before you implement it too as well, because they're the most impacted too. And don't say, oh, I forgot, or it's a complicated thing. Of course things are complicated, but if you're intentionally trying to use your power and privilege, you should ask them in the beginning and center the voices first. So I'll say
Good.
with that.
No, that's great. Kristen, what about you? Same question.
Can you say the question one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, what would be your one key takeaway you would want people to have from today's conversation? And if there was one action that they could take or think about implementing right away, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so for me, one key takeaway would be understanding your power or privilege and learning how to leverage that. And then kind of, with that really knowing yourself and that self-reflection, getting out there and acting on it. So, whether it's digging into a power that you have or a skill that you're really good at, or kind of looking and reflecting on the space where you need to grow a little bit to be your best self and show up the best for yourself and others.
Monica?
I would echo Kristen a little bit and say that be confident in who you are and recognizing that you have power and that you have privilege as well. Just because you may not be in a senior level role does not mean that you don't have a certain amount of power and privilege. And so recognizing that within yourself and being bold, taking a bold step. Nothing happens without you at least giving it a shot. There are people out here that have been able to be great innovators because they were bold and they recognize the power and the privilege they have within themselves to say, I'm going to give this a shot and I'm going to make this happen one way or the other, because the overall idea may not have necessarily come to fruition at that time, but there was one word or one statement or one quote that was within what they were trying to do that resonated. So recognize the fact that you have something to say, that you have abilities that can be very impactful, very influential, and then recognize too that the powers that you do have, which can be informational and reverence. I feel like those are the two most powerful powers that are typically abused. Don't abuse those powers. Instead, make sure that you know that those powers can be abused, but you're going to do the opposite and do what's best in the best interest of those powers and leverage those powers to make sure that you're mentoring and that you're embracing others and providing that pipeline for others to have a seat at the table to make some meaningful impact. That's what I hope everyone gets from this webinar.
Absolutely. With great power comes great responsibility. Ashley.
Thank you so much for this question. I think the question is one thing, but I'll probably sneak in like two things. I think on my end, when I'm moving from the interpersonal to the institutional, something that a mismatch that my brain has found, is, we talk about wanting to like impact systems or society or whatever, and yet when the time comes to do a thing or learn a thing, we whittle it and we distill down to interpersonal, individual. And so I think my big takeaway from just like listening to the other panelists, is if we want to impact systems, we have to center and stand on that. So for example, I'll flip this really quick. If we were wanting to make an impact on the way that our finances are at the organizations that we're a part of, we wouldn't check in with folks and be like, how do you feel about it though? Like, how do you feel about losing money? And like, wait, do you feel good? Does it make you feel uncomfortable? Do you like it? No, we would be like, we need to make sure that we spend this money in a way that is the best stewardship of our resources. This is how we prevent fraud, or this is how the specific skills that we want to teach people, so that they too can identify the scaries before they happen. So that I would say that the takeaway for me is, we've got to stay, if we're starting to get that interpersonal icky scary feeling of risk aversion, so be it. Put our mind back in the system space. That when we start to think about the what were you talking about before, Ms. Mo, the juice and the squeeze, it's like we might be a little bit uncomfortable, right? But on the end of it, if what we're aiming to do is bigger than ourselves, is bigger than even the organizations that we're working for, to me, that's when it starts to become more tangible. Like, oh, that's silly. If we're trying to make our society more or less of this by using our organizational resources to do that, then like how I feel, Sasha and I, and like this discomfort, that it becomes a much more manageable challenge to overcome.
Absolutely. What I would add to that for those of you in this space is that I think another thing that you can do is create a friend group that isn't work-based. Create an environment where you have the opportunity to find your people and realize that you are not defined as a worker, you are an individual who works. And so while you may spend a large part of your adult life in your workspace, if you know that your friendships are not as reliant on what you do at work because your friends really exist outside of that space, right? That no matter what job you're in, you aren't going to lose your community of support, right? That also will help you be more grounded to change the systems that exist because those personal losses are a lot more limited, I think, in that opportunity or in that space. With that, we do have a really great question I want to get to, which is in the beginning of the webinar, as people were introducing themselves, they described what they were wearing, their color of their hair, and their appearance. Was that for the benefit of people who are visually impaired, or was there another purpose? And I think, Ashley, you started us off, so please share, why did we do that today?
Yes, I don't think I was the first person, but I'm happy to answer. At least on my end, it was absolutely for that reason. So to ensure that folks that are blind, low vision, sight impaired, et cetera, whatever language that folks use to describe themselves, it's a way to just make sure that folks aren't missing either what's on screen, what's being seen, and so on. I've tried to remember another thing since we're talking about it. Sasha has been calling on us by name, and even still, I'm working on getting in the habit of saying this is Ashley speaking before I speak, just so that captioning as well can catch up with who's doing what, and that we have all that straightened away as well. Great question.
A great point. Jonathan, are there other things that we should be thinking about why certain things are chosen in this space to describe an individual, or can we point out some that we think are important?
Yeah, I love the mindset too, because there's a difference between we welcome everyone or the space isn't created with you in mind. So kind of being conscious of that too, of like we're again centering the experiences of people, from that, and kind of recognizing what that could be. So, Ashley's had a great answer, just to kind of, continue all her greatness that she said, was just thinking about like how, we're understanding from someone's perspective too. We're also making these ingrained into our systems and building on that too. So like, while that might have been a first experience for this person too, hopefully you see that future on too. It's a standard practice too. So it becomes like from like a coincidence to a habit, and that makes it easier in that way too as well, because when we kind of develop some of these habits too, it becomes easier to navigate different things. So kind of recognizing what that looks like too, and trying to, understand and recognize like, hey, who's everyone here that's going to be present in this space? How can we make sure all of them have as many barriers removed to engagement too, and then how to kind of center their experiences so that they're walking away with at least the same experiences we hope everyone to walk away with too as well. So, you know, a great kind of transition to think about how can we just ingrain these in our systems too? And it could be as simple as having checklists before going to initiatives to like get into the habit of like, we should do this, making sure that as well. Or again, asking people for feedback in the beginning of the process too, you know, to make sure that. So thinking about how to move again from these actions to systems.
I think that's really important. I really have started trying to think about that in my communications. So I have worked an awful lot with individuals who have dyslexia, and long emails are not the world's best tool, right? So I try very hard to think about what is my universal language style, and like, am I creating plain language in the beginning? Is the information organized in a way that helps individuals who struggle with attention of like reading long things? Is the organization presented in a way that it is going to bold what is needed for individuals who need to catch on to that because their reading acumen is not their superpower. Their superpower lays someplace else. So I think all of those things about normalizing what it is that you are individually doing really are all those steps to how do we use privilege for progress. So thank you all. You have been wonderful humans today, coming out, doing the work, sharing your stories, sharing the resources and information that you have. Again, we'll be giving this webinar out to all of you who have registered next Wednesday, along with probably some additional resources that came out of today's conversation. It's wonderful to see all the love that you all are getting. And last but not least, the two quick reminders for folks. Number one is Friday is the deadline for submissions to our wonderful conference that we talked about earlier. So I hope to see you as part of our educational team of presenters. And second of all, if you have interest in moving your career forward and learning more about our Leadership Academy through the Anchor Foundation, we'd love to have you check that out on our website as well. Thank you, everybody. So wonderful to see you, and I look forward to the next time we can convene. Bye, everyone.